Hans Frank, Hitler's conniving personal lawyer.
He saw the law as a means to power.
He twisted the legal system to sanction the Führer's crimes and enslaved a nation.
I despise him.
Under his tyrannical rule, millions of Polish Jews were sent to the gas chamber.
Every Jew was a target for extermination.
What turned a cultured lawyer into the monster known as the Butcher of Poland. Most people from my generation don't understand how over 70 years ago, a small group of Nazis could start a war that killed 60 million people. I want to find out, and to help me, I'm going to use playing cards. Today, they're used by both the military and law enforcement to help identify their targets. But nobody has ever put together a pack of cards for the most notorious group of killers in history. Working with experts, I want to know where each of these Nazis rank in the hierarchy of evil. My name is James Ellis. This is Hitler's Most Wanted. Why is Hitler's lawyer someone we should even care about?
If we were in Poland, Hans Frank would be an obvious choice to talk about. He was responsible for so many atrocities, so much suffering.
What I particularly find fascinating about Frank is that, he is a middle-class professional. He's a lawyer, and this is a classic example of how the trappings of kind of bourgeois respectability can be so easily subverted and used to promote something incredibly vile.
And history is filled with strong, smart, intelligent individuals who have ended up on the wrong side of morality.
Frank is absolutely pivotal. He has this massive role, he exterminates a lot of people, and he is right at the heart of the Third Reich.
Despite all of that, why do the majority of people still not know who he is? To answer the question, I've come to Germany, to the small town of Echlach, northwest of Hamburg.
So Nicholas, tell me, what do we have here?
Some pictures. This first one is Hitler before he took over power in Germany. My father was his personal liar between, I would say, 28 and 33 of the last century.
Author and journalist Nicholas Frank is the youngest of Hans Frank's 5 children. He's the only one among them to have denounced their father.
And here you can see little Nicholas.
And this kid is you?
Yeah, that kid is me.
How old are you here?
2 years.
2 years old.
Yes. I hated this close.
Hans Frank was appointed Governor General of Poland when the country fell to the Germans in 1939. Nicholas spent his first years as a witness to his father's rule over the occupied territory.
And here's the King of Poland, my father, on the tower of the Wawel Castle. And this I hate especially, this picture.
Why?
Yes, because at this direction was the ghetto, at this direction was concentration camp, down in the streets, everywhere, the SS guards, and he was pretending here to be a peaceful, far-looking statesman. He knew exactly what he really was, the governor of, on a sea of blood.
Before his death, Hans Frank wrote a note to each of his children inside a small book of prayers.
And here's the inscription. It was written on the 18th of September 1946.
And what does the message roughly say?
In most heartful love, he gives me this small prayer book, and he wishes me a very good life under the merciful guard of God.
And how do you feel when you read it now?
This is all lies. This is all lies. Why didn't he write, my dear beloved Nicky? I was a criminal. I am sure that I will get the death penalty. And it's right. Please have a little bit more civil courage, which I never had. Please lead quite a different life. Yours, Fatih,
So you wish he'd admitted to his crimes and taken responsibility for his actions?
Yeah. I despise him.
How did Hans Frank become such a terrifying and hated figure? Not just to his own flesh and blood, but to a whole nation. To find out, I'm in Berlin, the city where Hans Frank first came to Hitler's attention.
You have to be a certain way to get attracted to a movement like the Nazis.
Yes.
What was it about the Nazi Party that attracted Hans Frank?
I mean, I think it's an excellent question in the sense that it's not an obvious home for a lawyer.
No.
The principle of National Socialism is precisely that people are not equal, and that what they say overrides the law.
Yeah.
Dr. Henning Grunwald is an expert on legal history during the Weimar Republic. I want to understand how Hans Frank became a Nazi and rose through party ranks.
So what was the environment in which he became a lawyer?
Well, it was the Weimar Republic, so a very politically fraught environment, and Frank, from his father, who was a failed lawyer, imbued him with attitudes that we would call quite clearly anti-Semitic.
Hans Frank was born into a professional middle-class family, a very patriotic family. His brother was killed in action in World War I. Hans Frank himself joined the military after high school, but never saw action before the armistice was signed.
At the end of the First World War, you've got young men looking for a purpose. In many ways, they're rootless. They've come back from war, or they've just missed out on the war, but there's no obvious job for them to fall into. And then, of course, you've got the Treaty of Versailles, negotiated by the Allies, very much against Germany, really making Germany pay for that war. And so when you've got a voice like Hitler's saying to the millions of young men like Hans Frank, I'm going to save this, I'm going to sort this out, it's not surprising that men like Frank can fall under his spell.
Hans Frank joined the early Nazi movement in Munich. But it wasn't until he started defending Nazi thugs, known as stormtroopers, that he came to the Führer's attention.
How does he become Hitler's lawyer?
Yeah. So, in 1928, he represented Hitler himself in the so-called Italian gold trials, which turned around allegations in the electoral campaign of 1928 that Hitler essentially was in Mussolini's pocket. Frank pleaded on Hitler's behalf, and then on the back of that, managed to persuade him to become his lawyer, to become the Nazi Party lawyer.
Frank goes on to represent many Nazis in the courts, but his personal mission was to do much more than defend individual clients. He just needed an opportunity.
In late September 1930, Nazi officers are accused in the so-called Ulm-Reichswehr trial. So this is about a group of 3 National Socialist officers who have formed a kind of, if you will, revolutionary cell.
3 junior military officers were charged with spreading Nazi doctrines, and Frank used that trial to dramatically defend them and to defend Nazism more broadly.
But it's Frank's star witness who steals the show.
Frank's real stroke of sort of genius there was to put Hitler out and as a witness under oath.
Hitler knows that he can't just appeal to disaffected youth. No, what he also needs to do is to impress the bourgeoisie. And these are people who take the rule of law very seriously. They know that the rule of law gives stability. And if the Nazi Party can seem part of that stable structure, then it makes it appear far more acceptable, far more legitimate, and therefore far more likely for Hitler to get into power.
Hitler says, I sympathize with these officers in the dock. You know, they have the right ideas, but the wrong means. You know, we will seek power only by legal means.
The trial was a media sensation, and it became Frank's signature case. The accused are found guilty, but given lenient sentences. But for Hans Frank, the verdict was irrelevant.
There's a lot of newspaper coverage, inimical, friendly. It doesn't matter, because in this case, the exposure is everything. The trial really was crucial both for the Nazi Party and for the trajectory of Frank's career.
Frank's skillful manipulation of the courtroom led to a dramatic turn in both his and the Führer's fortunes. In the 1930 election, the Nazis took 18% of the popular vote and were now the second largest political party in Germany.
So Frank really plays a key role in legitimizing the Nazi Party
Yes.
to a large group of German society.
Yes, precisely.
By 1933, Hitler had risen to power in Germany. The Führer rewarded Frank for his loyalty with political appointments. But where he really made his mark is behind the scenes as the party's chief legal policymaker.
Es ist daher Aufgabe des Rechts, diese, das Charakteristische des deutschen Lebens ausmachende und die schöpferische Wurzel aller deutschen Tat gewährleistende Rassensubstanz des deutschen Volkes mit aller Macht, aller Welt gegenüber zu schützen.
There are those who follow laws, and there are those who create and shape them. Individuals who follow laws tend to be moral, law-abiding citizens. Individuals that create and shape laws don't necessarily fall into that category. In fact, history is marred with evidence of individuals who have used their own power and their ability to create and shape laws to their own discretion, regardless of morality and ethics.
One of Frank's first acts was to target so-called enemies in his own profession.
It starts with the Jews that were evicted, quite literally, right, from the courthouses. You know, on the morning of 7th of April, these stormtroopers came and basically said, we will, you know, remove all Jewish lawyers.
The names of more than 600 of those professionals are listed here.
These people were driven out of the legal profession and ultimately murdered because they were Jews. Frank was central in driving them out and thereby facilitating their murder.
So this to me really exemplifies the contempt that Hans Frank and the Nazis had for the law.
Basically, he saw the law as a means to power.
But for Hans Frank, this was just the beginning.
The Jews in general are an object of Frank's policy who have to be destroyed.
My quest to find out where Hans Frank sits in the hierarchy of evil has brought me to the Polish city of Krakow, where Hitler's personal lawyer spent most of the war.
What I've come here to explore is this. What happened to turn a man with an exceptional legal mind into the monster known as the Butcher of Poland?
The Germans invaded Poland in September 1939, instigating the bloodiest military conflict in modern history. After the military victory, Hitler appointed Hans Frank Governor General of the occupied territory. In a gesture that would foreshadow his despotic rule, Hans Frank moved into Wawel Castle, the former royal residence of Polish kings.
It was right here that Hans Frank established himself as a pseudo-monarch, ruling over his Polish realm.
Frank's first order of business was to implement Nazi racist doctrine. At its core was the persecution of the Jews.
So is this part of the ghetto wall?
This is the left part of the ghetto wall, yes.
To learn how he accomplished this, I'm turning to historian Dr. Magnus Brachtken. He's brought me to an infamous symbol of Nazi cruelty.
The plaque says to those who became the victims of Hitler and the occupation.
Well, should we have a look and see what it looks like on the other side, around here?
Okay.
So how personally involved was Hans Frank in the creation and the implementation of the Krakow ghetto?
When the war started and he was established here, Frank wanted to get his area as free of Jews as the rest of the Reich.
Hans Frank immediately began implementing anti-Semitic measures.
He starts very quickly enacting laws against the Jews, stripping them of all their rights and stripping them, frankly, of their dignity.
Across Poland, the Nazis closed synagogues and plundered Jewish homes. They mandated forced labor for any Jew over the age of 12. In 1940, Frank upped the ante, introducing a brutal new measure to segregate the Jewish population.
Ghettos are effectively prisons. There's no other word to describe them. There's a great big wall around it, there's a barbed wire around it, there are troops patrolling it. It's also another way of proving your utter superiority over another people. What do? You fence them in, you wall them in, you block them in.
So these buildings would have been inside the ghetto?
Inside the ghetto, yes.
So people would have been crammed into these?
Yeah, and of course it's concentrated. You have the wall around it and you are not allowed to get out. And the conditions would be very rough because there is little options to have food and all the necessary everyday support in here.
The Nazis built hundreds of ghettos across Poland. The Warsaw Ghetto was the largest. 400,000 people were confined to 3.4 kilometers of space.
You can imagine the overcrowding, the filth, the hunger, the deprivation. Add to that the Nazis were forcing Jews in the ghetto to participate in forced labor. They were farming them out essentially to German companies and factories.
Oh, it looks like there's another part of the wall here.
Yeah, indeed.
What really hits home for me is there would have been children behind these walls.
It's a playground on the other side today, which is a very strange contrast to imagine how it would have been there in 1941, 1942, 43.
In 2.5 years of the occupation, 83,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto alone died from disease and starvation.
People tried to survive somehow, to get some food, to get a normal life, if we can call it normal at all. It was all covered by this permanent threat and all covered by the need to get something to eat, which is at the heart of everything. And if you get ill, it's of course more or less a death sentence.
Yeah, it's just horrifying. Every day it was just about trying to survive to the next day.
Exactly.
The tombstone shape of Krakow's ghetto walls was tragically prophetic.
The Nazis decided to build ghettos throughout Poland because they wanted to make it easier to round up the Jews when it came to slaughter them. You know where to get them when you want to deport them to the camps.
Across occupied Europe, Hitler's deputies implemented the final solution: the deliberate and systematic extermination of the Jews. Despite the grossly criminal directive, Hans Frank showed no objection to state-organized mass murder.
People often conflate intelligence and wisdom with morality. We assume that people who are intelligent enough to know better are going to fall on the right side of ethics and morality, but this isn't necessarily the case.
Addressing his senior officials in late 1941, Hans Frank insisted they show no mercy in carrying out the Führer's plan.
And then people were deported to the death camps, extermination camps, and most of them were killed there.
It's just so crazy for me just to think that people could have that thought process, to sit around and say, right, we're going to make this policy of our regime to do that.
The Jews in general are an object of the National Socialist policy, of Frank's policy, who have to be destroyed.
By the end of the war, after 5.5 years of brutal occupation, 3 million Jews, 90% of Poland's Jewish population, were murdered by the Nazis.
Hans Frank was rightly known and is rightly remembered as the Butcher of Poland. He ruled with an iron fist and in an incredibly cruel way. His mission was to exterminate the Jewish population of Poland. Every Jew was a target for extermination.
But Hans Frank doesn't stop with the genocide of Poland's Jews. He is determined to wipe an entire nation off the map.
For them, Polish people only being something like slaves.
I'm in Krakow, the center of Nazi occupation in Poland during the war, to investigate Hans Frank. He ruled the Nazi-held territory, and I'm here to learn about his role in the Führer's chilling plans for a conquered nation. When was this museum founded?
There's the first exhibition in 1991.
Mateusz Gaulik is a historian at the Home Army Museum. He is an expert on Poland's resistance movement during the Second World War.
We have some letter paper. Hans Frank used it when he wrote, for example, orders to his officers, orders like shoot somebody and so on. And we have an original paper, letter paper. For example, you see Heil Hitler, Hans Frank is his signature.
As Poland's de facto ruler, Hans Frank was tasked with paving the way for the Führer's cold-blooded vision in the occupied territory.
Generalplan Ost, or General Plan East, was a big master plan drawn up by the Nazis and under, obviously, the stewardship of Hitler to basically conquer and subdue everything east of Berlin, all the way through to Moscow. You were going to treat all these lands as a kind of breadbasket for the German people. The existing people there, the Untermenschen, the subhumans, would be driven even further east, and then all that territory was then going to be lived in by Germanic settlers. Generalplan Ost basically called for a liquidation of millions of people, an occupation of millions of square miles of territory. It was absolutely barbaric.
Untermensch is a term in Nazi racial ideology. It essentially means subhuman, and it referred to the groups that the Nazis saw as racially inferior. Of course, the Jews are the most prominent example, but the Nazis also saw Slavs as racially inferior, as a population fit only for servitude and eventual displacement.
To enact the Führer's plan, Frank opened Poland's doors to Nazi death squads in September 1939. They started at the very top of Polish society.
I know that when the Germans occupied Poland, one of the first things they did is try to remove the sort of Polish elites.
Yes, exactly. First prisoners in the concentration camp in Auschwitz were teachers, priests, professors from the University of, for example, here from Krakow.
It seems to me as if the Germans were trying to turn Poland into a slave state.
Yeah, exactly. For them, Polish people only being something like slaves. They working in the concentration camp, in worker camp.
To the Germans, Poland was to become nothing more than a giant labor camp. What Hans Frank hadn't counted on, however, was the indomitable spirit of the Polish people.
This is an amazing collection of firearms.
Yeah, MG42, rifles like Mosin, Mausers, Panzerfaust, MG34, for example, Polish mortars, a lot of guns.
The Home Army Museum features a small arsenal, once used by those who dared to fight the Germans.
The Polish Home Army was essentially a semi-uniformed resistance to Hitler and the occupying Nazi forces. These were incredibly brave men and women, and what they were doing was trying to hamper as much of the German occupation as they could. Frank, of course, absolutely loathed them and wanted to destroy them.
The Home Army was a symbol for not only of our military resistance, but also is a symbol of freedom, that we cannot give up. Even in the 1939, everybody believed that we win this war. Maybe not this year, maybe next year, but we win. And when we resistance to Germans, then we have a hope.
So it was about fighting back and keeping the hope alive that one day Poland will be liberated from the Nazis.
Yes, because you see death in every day.
The Home Army counted nearly 400,000 members by 1944, but they were fighting with scraps.
So obviously the MG42 is a German machine gun.
Yeah, German machine gun which Home Army captured from a train. And you see that nicknames of Polish soldiers. For example, Hardy, tough guy.
So the people who captured these engraved their nicknames on them?
They use it, and is my weapon. I shoot it, and is a part of me. And I wrote my nickname.
Amazing.
One thing that stands out about Poland during World War II is that you had an effective and organized armed resistance to the Nazis. It was able to sabotage and slow down and foil some Nazi plans to impose their will on Poland.
The most well-known act of Polish resistance to the Germans is the Warsaw Uprising in the summer of 1944.
As the Allies advanced towards Berlin, the Home Army feels incredibly empowered by the fact that the Red Army, Stalin's forces, are coming in from the east, and they're going to sweep, hopefully, into Warsaw and liberate it from the Nazis. And so, as Stalin approaches, the Home Army decides to rise up, fight street by street throughout Warsaw. What happens is appalling. Stalin and the Red Army stop, and he lets the rising fail. He wants the Germans to crush the Poles, and then he's then going to crush the Germans.
After 63 days of bitter fighting, the far better armed Wehrmacht defeated the uprising. So how did the Germans respond to attacks by the Polish Home Army?
I'll give you an example. When Polish resistance Home Army officer killed Polish actor who collaborate with Germans, they killed 150 people in Warsaw.
150 people?
Yes. Because Polish resistance killed one actor.
For one actor?
Yeah.
That's horrifying. The reprisals against those who dared to fight the Nazis were merciless. And even the very act of trying to stay alive could mean death.
Here we have just little piece of pork fat.
Yep.
For that thing, I would go to Treblinka camp.
You would go to a death camp?
Yes.
For just having pork fat?
It was banned.
On my mission to figure out where Hans Frank sits in Hitler's hierarchy of evil, I've come to the home of author Aleksandra Zubrotko-Janicka. She's written extensively on Polish women and daily life under the German occupation. Right, so I just ladle beans in here?
We have to process them to mousse.
I'm here to learn how Poles resisted Frank's brutal regime on the home front.
But be careful for your fingers.
I will. I'll try not to grind anything off. We're baking a cake with the same limited ingredients Poles had in the war, when food was strictly rationed by the Germans. And so they could grow the beans themselves, so it was very efficient to cook with beans.
Gardening was very popular because everyone tried to grow veggies to eat them. Starvation was a huge problem.
The Nazi policy of rationing food during the occupation of Poland was really a policy of starvation. It was a policy of genocide carried out through starvation, and it wasn't carried out equally.
Using a food rationing system, the Nazis set out to starve the Poles. Non-Jews were given just enough food to keep them in chains. The Jews got the very worst of it. Their allotment of food wouldn't keep them alive for long. How many ingredients go into the cake?
Just 3.
Just 3 ingredients?
Yes.
Why so few?
During wartime, there was a real struggle to get some elaborate ingredients.
Life under Hans Frank became one long fight for survival. At harvest time, German troops went to the countryside to steal crops for export to Germany. Peasants were shot for not fulfilling their quota. The Poles turned to the black market to stay alive. They grew vegetables in secret or raised livestock in locations hidden from the Germans.
People have an innate instinct to survive. In life and death situations, people may be willing to do things that they wouldn't normally be comfortable doing, things that may go against their moral code.
So by making a cake like this, it's not only part of surviving, it's also part of resisting.
Exactly. Thanks to Polish women who really smuggling those banned produce, people can eat, people can resist. So we have to mix egg yolks with our sweetener.
Okay.
We have to put our beans into the mix.
So you're using the whole of the egg, you're using both the yolks and the whites.
Nothing could go to waste. Even breadcrumbs were used.
How am I looking?
Better.
Better?
Yeah.
Under Frank's repressive regime, Polish women risked their lives to feed their families. And what would happen if they were caught with ingredients that were banned?
I'll show you. Here we have just a little piece of pork fat.
Yep.
For that thing, I would go to Treblinka camp.
You would go to a death camp
Yes.
for just having pork fat?
It was banned. Pork fat or having unregistered porks, that was a capital offense.
So it was a death sentence to be found with something like this in your possession?
Yes, there are many examples of people that were taken out of a train and killed next to train, just on the side.
Wow.
It was awful, it was scary, but Poles always find a way.
The only way that Poles could survive the harsh rationing imposed by Hans Frank was to rely on very creative strategies, usually devised by Polish women, to subvert and undercut the rationing system. This involved the black market, this involved smuggling. This was the only way for anyone to survive the forced starvation.
That looks great. Look at that.
It looks almost like sponge cake.
It does. I'd say I've never had white bean cake before. This is like... It's really good. I can't believe this is just 3 major ingredients.
Polish wartime cookery books are full of recipes like that.
Yet despite the efforts to subvert Nazi-engineered famine, hundreds of thousands of Jews and non-Jewish Poles died from starvation and disease during the war, and Hans Frank was the man who orchestrated it all. The Butcher of Poland's reign eventually came to an end. I want to find out how, from someone who witnessed Frank's demise firsthand.
What is left in my memory is cowardice.
To complete my investigation into Hans Frank's story, I've returned to Germany to speak with his son once again. Nicholas?
Hi, James.
Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me again. Nicholas has a unique perspective on the rise and fall of Hans Frank's tyranny.
So he loved very much his office on the Wawel, the castle of Krakow, where all the former Polish kings were residing. And he was happy about his 111 uniforms.
111.
And especially happy he was about his Mercedes, because his Mercedes has the same yellow light like Hitler's Mercedes had.
The post of Governor General over occupied Poland conferred more than just power. It gave Hans Frank status and wealth. Despite his legal training, during his 5 years ruling over the Polish people, Frank flouted his ability to break the law, thinking nothing of stealing precious works of art and giving jewels robbed from Jews to his wife and mistress.
Frank was spending an enormous sum of money to bring in fineries, riches. His wife was particularly drawn to furs. So they were buying luxuries, they were plundering wealth, to the point that Hans Frank's wife would even go shopping in the Krakow ghetto and try to get what she referred to as bargains from the very desperate population there.
He became the king of Poland. And he was so happy. And he never cared about all the victims in his country.
And when did you become aware of your father's crimes?
It started when they arrested my father at our village in Upper Bavaria on the 4th of May, 1945.
Yeah.
If you want a measure of what kind of man Hans Frank was, you only have to see what he does when the Soviets reach the gates of Krakow, you know, his kind of medieval castle. He flees.
As the Red Army closed in from the east, Hans Frank gathered his family, truckloads of stolen art, and hightailed it back to Germany. He hid out in the Bavarian Alps until he was arrested by the Americans and taken to Nuremberg to stand trial for war crimes. In the dock, he downplayed his knowledge of and role in the Holocaust.
Frank spun fables at his trial in an attempt to keep himself alive. It's laughable that Frank didn't have personal, direct knowledge of exactly what was happening, not only in the ghettos that he created and oversaw, but in the death camps, 4 of which were in the territory of occupied Poland, of which he was the Governor General.
Instead of owning up to his heinous crimes, Hans Frank tried to pass off his behavior as the work of an evil alter ego.
He told the psychiatrist in Nuremberg in his cell that he is sure that he himself is 2 persons. The one is a lawyer, the well-educated piano player, and the other is this ugly guy.
And what do you think?
He was just one person, one character, one mass murderer.
So as far as you're concerned, there's absolutely no way that your father could not have known about all the atrocities that were being committed by the Nazis in Poland?
Right. He knew everything. Also, my mother knew everything. They knew exactly what was going on every day, what was going on in the ghetto, in the concentration camp.
What's the hardest part about being the son of Hans Frank?
The hardest thing to think every day of him, to know nearly everything about his involvement in all those horrible crimes.
Hans Frank was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was hanged in October 1946. So what's this here?
This is my biggest joy every day. This is the coat of my father. I can see it from our living room, sitting there and saying every day to my father, that's the only thing you have deserved, being a scapegoat at our little lake. And since then, he is standing here, and I'm very happy.
Why does it make you happy?
It shows for me that what is left of him in my memory, his crimes, and even more, his cowardice. And when I look at him, I always accuse him, why have you done all of this? So what is really left from him is this coat, which he loved very much, and in which he also distributed so much fear to all the others who saw it. And now he's standing here and only the birds have to be afraid of him.
Now that I know Hans Frank's central role in the brutal and lengthy occupation of Poland, it's time to figure out where he stacks up in Hitler's hierarchy.
You can slaughter them, lock them up, kill them, eradicate them. It doesn't matter. They're not human beings.
My visits to Poland and Germany have helped me understand Hans Frank's role in the Third Reich. Now it's time for us to decide where this Nazi lands in the hierarchy of evil. Using our unique system of playing cards, I want to determine where Hans Frank ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted.
The experience which had the biggest impact on me was meeting Hans Frank's son, Nicholas. I was amazed by Nicholas' bravery because I could not imagine publicly eviscerating my own father. But in his case, he feels people need to understand his father's crime.
In a very public, unvarnished, and raw way, Nicholas Frank is modeling what he thinks German society should do in general to grapple with the familial and the national legacy of the Nazi era. He has a message for subsequent generations and particularly for contemporary Germans. And that message isn't one of guilt or shame, it's responsibility.
For Nicholas, disseminating his father's story is vital to confronting Germany's past and preventing the reoccurrence of the heinous crimes committed across Poland during the Second World War.
Why was the Nazi occupation of Poland so brutal?
The Nazis regarded Poland as their own backyard. It was their territory to do with exactly how they liked, And the people they lived there, they didn't really regard as people. They regarded them as being subhuman. Now, if you start, regarding another human being as being no better than a sheep or a pig or a cattle, then it's much easier to do with them exactly what you like. So you can slaughter them, lock them up, kill them, eradicate them. It doesn't matter. They're not human beings.
I agree. Hans Frank's goals in Poland were to exterminate the Jews as quickly as possible and to enslave and deplace the ethnic Polish population.
If you see these individuals as subhuman, then to some extent you don't even interpret the behaviors that you're committing against them as immoral, as a way to get around your own morality.
A key player in the Führer's master plan for the East, Hans Frank warped the law to encourage persecution, enslavement, starvation, and genocide.
You are all united in the fact that he was a central figure in the Nazi regime. But why do the majority of people know nothing about him?
I think part of the problem is that very few people in Western Europe and in North America actually study and look at the experience of Eastern Europe and Poland in particular. I think that's a great shame, and I think that Frank is someone who we need to know a lot more about.
The creation of the ghettos, the systematic starvation of the Polish people, and the state-sanctioned mass murder of the Jews were all overseen in the territory Hans Frank ruled. These atrocities place him well inside Hitler's circle of evil.
What I'd like to do now is to come to some sort of conclusion as to where you think Hans Frank should rank in the Nazi hierarchy of evil. Anthony, you go first.
Hans Frank, as a lawyer, played a large role in popularizing the Nazi Party, but he wasn't the only lawyer involved with doing that. As Governor General of occupied Poland, he was certainly central to the atrocities committed there, but he wasn't central to the leadership of the Reich. At the same time, we have to take into account the sheer brutality, the sheer suffering of his reign. I say he's number 20.
Matt?
On the one hand, I agree, he's just a lawyer. On the other hand, 3 million Jews and countless Poles died in Poland under his reign. I think he's more significant. I'm going to put him around 12.
He destroyed millions of people. He ruled over a vast segment of the Third Reich with the utmost barbarity. For me, he's got to be in the top 10. I'm going to give him an 8.
So the three of you have different views there in where you think he should rank. For me, it's quite simple. His fingerprints are on some of the worst Nazi atrocities. He has the blood of millions on his hands. I therefore rank him at number 10. He is the Queen of Hearts.
Though he was well trained to know right from wrong, Hans Frank was nothing more than a vicious thug and a remorseless thief. For the genocide of Poland's Jews and the untold suffering of millions of non-Jewish Poles, Hans Frank makes it into the top 10 of Hitler's most wanted.